I'm Tim Monroe, and this is what I really want to talk about. There's something fascinating about every single one of us. Everybody has a passion and a story to tell, something that lights them up. Every week I sit down with interesting people and we talk about the things that really matter to them and to all of us. It might be funny, it might be weighty, it might be weird. It's what I really want to talk about. My guest today is Denise Vargas. Denise is the executive director of Hogar in Honduras. The organization's mission is to provide children from vulnerable conditions with the opportunity to become future leaders. Denise has over 20 years of executive level experience specializing in strategic planning, business model innovation, organizational and team development, and entrepreneurship. She's the founder of Impact Strategies, a consulting and training company that specializes in supporting leaders and entrepreneurs with a particular focus on programs for women and youth. She earned a BA in Romance Languages and Psychology from Dartmouth College and later earned an MBA focused on finance. She worked in New York as counselor for the Honduras mission to the United Nations, where she spoke before the General Assembly and the Security Council on topics related to women, poverty, and war. She's been a mentor to women entrepreneurs and leaders to support their business growth and personal development. Also, Denise is a fellow of the Central American Leadership Initiative and a member of the Aspen Global Leadership Network. Wow. On top of all this, Denise is a poet and a firm believer in the value of art and the development of empathetic creative individuals. She's published 2 books of poetry, with a third coming out soon. And full disclosure, Denise and I worked together closely for 4 years, maybe, as I was the executive director of Hogar in the US and she was in Honduras. So Denise, welcome. What do you want to talk about today?
Tim, I'd love to talk about poetry and living in a state of wonder because of it.
Living in a state of wonder because of it. Oh my gosh, I'm very excited about that. So before we enter our state of wonder, can you talk a little bit about 2 things? One, just sort of, what was it like to grow up in Tegucigalpa in Honduras? I think a lot of our listeners, probably almost all of our listeners, unless we share it with all your friends, will never have been to Tegucigalpa.
Yeah.
And then as you think about that, sort of, what was the moment when you realized or understood that poetry was important to you?
hmm Yeah. Well, growing up in Honduras, I always describe it as living among contrasts. And the absolute stunning mountains that surround the city are always in our view. And we are always blessed by this amazing weather,
Yeah.
the sunshine, t-shirt weather all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But we're also surrounded by a harsh reality of poverty and chaos. It's a
Mm-hmm.
chaotic city. It's a
Mm-hmm.
loud city. I was very fortunate to grow up in a very loving home and in a beautiful area of the city also, with my parents who were 2 hardworking people, professionals. My father was a doctor. My mom is a doctor, and my mom, he's just retired. That's why I said
Mm-hmm.
was. And my
Yeah.
mom is a retired teacher, and 2 siblings. So I always lived in that line between feeling absolutely blessed, but also a little bit concerned and in pain of
Mm-hmm.
what I witnessed growing up, of people who lacked the same opportunities and who were in vulnerable conditions. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So as a child or a young woman, when did you sort of first think about poetry as something that meant a lot to you?
yeah, I was exposed to poetry in school.
Mm-hmm.
I read a few books early on that had poetry and several teachers also. So that's when I discovered the beauty of poetry, but I realized it was going to be important to me when I went through a difficult moment in my life, and I recognized it was around bullying, and a friend of mine was getting bullied
Mm-hmm.
regularly. And I remember discovering a poem when I visited my grandmother's house, and I understood the healing power of poetry and how it could allow me to connect my experience to the experience of someone who had lived decades before I had never met. And so that connection that was formed and that
Yeah.
universal truth of emotions,
Yeah.
made me feel, um, it validated my emotions, and
Hmm.
it also made me feel less lonely, less separate.
Yeah. Can you
Yeah.
remember the poet or the poem that you?
The poet was Rendario, and he
Yeah.
talked about, um, dichoso. He talked about how lucky a tree or a rock was because it barely felt,
Mm, wow.
because it was barely sensitive.
Right.
And
Right.
so, for me, uh, understanding that it also helped me understand I don't want to live like that. I
Yeah.
embrace
Yes.
all this emotion.
Yes. I know that
And
about you.
yes, so I embrace emotions, but it allowed me to. And also, I think another poem, another line by Rumi, that said that, the wound is the place where the light, uh, shines in. I don't know the
Mm,
exact, wording of
yeah.
that
Yeah.
verse, but both of those lines really help embrace who I am, and it helped
Hmm.
me understand the power of poetry.
Amazing. So, when you first said what you really want to talk about, you talked about poetry, and I think you said living in a state of wonder. Okay.
Yeah,
What do you mean by that? What is to you, what is living in a state of wonder?
to me is looking at everything that's around me, the day to day,
Hmm.
from the cup of coffee in the morning to the tree that's outside my window, and every single time finding a way of discovering a hidden meaning or a hidden angle to it. So I feel like poetry keeps me in a state of seeking or discovery,
Hmm.
because there's so many layers of meaning to anything.
Yeah.
uh, a, a branch, a shadow, the way, a book is placed on a coffee table. Everything can have a metaphor hidden inside, or it can connect us to something else. And, so I think that, I also feel that if I'm surrounded by books of poetry, I can open any book and suddenly experience an emotion and transport me
Hmm.
very quickly to another
Hmm.
dimension, another state of existence. And so I've come to embrace the possibility of that poetry brings, to travel, to feel, to see far beyond the day to day.
So, what is it about poetry, say, as opposed to some other art form like a novel or a
Mm,
painting or a film, that sort of creates those conditions for you? Um, why is,
mm.
what is it about that form that sort
Yeah.
of brings you into that state?
I think it's the way poetry is so condensed in a few words, and it encapsulates an emotion with just a line or a verse. For example,
Yeah.
yesterday I was sitting on a bench, and I came across a poem I had read before, and it said, to to be inside a room, and these are poems in Spanish, so I
Right. So you're
apologize for
translating
the
for us. Yes.
translation.
Thank you for that.
Uh,
Yeah.
to be inside a room in a place where I can collect all my separate parts and bring them together with tenderness. For example,
Hmm.
that's how the verse goes.
Hmm.
There is a certain vagueness
Hmm.
to that line
Hmm.
that it can be interpreted in many ways, and even depending on the moment you're in. With
Hmm.
a novel, there's a very
Hmm.
specific context. There's often a lot more specificity
Hmm.
to it, and poetry sort of leaves it open like a question.
Hmm.
And so one can sort of fall into it depending on the moment that we're living, or adapt it to our own reality and situation much more. And
Hmm.
it's also one line that can
Yeah.
hit you. So I
Yeah.
think for me, those two things.
And have you always had, I mean, I think of poetry, and you're sort of just saying this as the ultimate distillation of language. It's a way to sort of, um, how when people talk about, sometimes when people talk about sculpture, let's say you're
Mhm,
sculpting out of stone, and they say that the thing is in there. You just have to get rid of everything that's
mhm,
not that
mhm,
that work, that image,
mhm,
whatever you want. And I think of poetry similarly in that,
mhm.
it's as much about what you leave out as what you put in, right?
So much.
And
And yeah,
so, have you always had this sort of facility for words, for finding the right words, for
I think I've always had a
understanding them?
fascination with
Yeah.
words.
Yeah.
My mom would tell you if she ever met you that I think when I was 8 or 9, I started speaking backwards and spelling, and I was always in spelling bee and always
Uh-huh.
reading and loving. I love to find different meanings to words. So for sure, my life has been surrounded by words and the power of words. Um, but poetry hasn't been easy for me. I
No.
think that
Right.
writing is a difficult task that one must be very passionate about to do it.
Yeah.
I think the process, I love what you talked about distillation because, I tend to write a poem from beginning to end, but then the process of editing the poem takes a long time. And what do I
Right.
keep and what do I take out?
Right.
And I think that's also a metaphor for living and
Mm,
memories too.
mm,
In a way, it's like, okay, this is the way I want to hold on to this story.
mm-hmm.
It's being intentional about the stories I tell and how I want to keep it and how I want to phrase it, and even the art of publishing sort of consolidates this story, this version of it.
Yeah. And I like that idea of comparing poetry to sort of um, capturing the stories that we keep
Mhm.
about ourselves, about our lives. Like, what is that story that we want to that we want to remember, and what are the parts that we may not want to may not want to keep? So, what's your you alluded to this a little bit, but when you're writing a poem, what is your process?
Mhm.
Are you daily and disciplined? Are you driven by inspiration? How does it work for you?
I definitely don't write every day. What I seek to do every day, and I've mentioned this in the past, I think in different conversations, what I seek to do every day is find a state of poetry,
Mm-hmm.
to enter a poetic state. So my rituals, instead of what I call a ritual, is um, moments of meditation and reading and quiet in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that is a very important part of my life,
Mm-hmm.
usually around coffee
Mm-hmm.
and with myself. So I think that entering that poetic state is what I do daily, but usually poetry finds me as
Mm.
opposed to
Yeah.
a writer that has the discipline to sit down every day and write, which I think is admirable, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that I haven't ever had that type of discipline, but I do have the openness that if I have the inspiration for a poem, I try to stop for it and say,
Yeah.
okay, I'm going to write this down and
Mm.
then finish it later.
Right. I mean, I think as you know, I'm a writer too, and I've quote unquote written a novel, and now I'm in revision sort of
Mhm.
mode at this point, which is a very different process. But
Yeah,
um, and
it's exciting.
when I was in the writing mode, um, you do sort of have to almost like you just got to get something done every day, even if
Mhm.
it's bad, even if it's not good. But I
Yeah.
do think too that you know there are some days when you were talking about the poetic state,
Mhm.
or you can call it the creative state. I think for any writer, there are some days when you feel sort of fully in that state and things are flowing more, and then some days when you're kind of forcing it, right?
Yeah,
And it might not be there, right? You might not feel that inspiration or have that sort of germ of an idea, or yeah. I mean, I think
absolutely. I think that
some
there are
combination,
days when also your life is just taking over.
right?
You may start in a poetic state. It helps you
Mm-hmm.
maybe stay in a steady state, but it's hard to
Yeah.
produce. It's hard to create.
Yeah,
Um,
and one of the things, what's interesting about doing this podcast is that this is your episode 6.
oh,
So I'm still learning, but almost everybody has this thing in common, and that is that they have a passion that may not necessarily be their how they make a living,
oh,
but it's a passion that requires thought, time,
yeah,
commitment. And almost everybody I've talked to, I think everybody I talk to, on top of this passion, also has a family, a full-time job, children, spouses, partners, etc. So, how do you integrate poetry into your what I know this for sure is an extremely busy life.
yeah, yeah. I think poetry. I've understood that poetry helps me be better at everything else.
Mm,
And so I nurture it as a way of being more present, more empathetic, more creative, find better solutions at work, connect with more wisdom to my family. I feel that there's always a poem I can relate to in a circumstance also because I have the fortune of the wisdom of the ages, right? These poets that have written and have experienced so much, so I can bring some of that. I no longer see it as competing.
Mm-hmm.
There were periods of, especially when I'm working on publishing a book,
Mm-hmm.
and the work of the publishing
Yeah.
um,
Give a
is
deadline.
very time consuming because you have deadlines and then you
Mm-hmm.
have pressure, etc.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, I also think that even, for example, my daughter, my youngest daughter, she became she is a very artistic soul, but
Mm.
her medium has been completely different.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, I think that some of her seeing me embrace this art and the time it takes is also a good example for her to
Yes.
feel, okay, I can embrace a passion and it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have to be what I do.
Right. Right.
So yeah, I think that we also the beauty of poetry is that it can hit you all at once. So I think in my case, another way of doing it is not to expect perfect balance,
Mm-hmm.
but harmony.
Right.
So there will be weeks with emptiness, and then there
Mm-hmm.
will be weeks with massive inspiration and focus on it. So allowing that not day to day, but week to week or month to month, sort of.
Yeah. So not putting the pressure on yourself to crank out certain, lines a day or something like that, but being more
Yeah.
flexible about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
also think that I don't know if it happens to you, but I'm writing all the time.
Mm-hmm.
um as when I'm with someone, the experiences I live, I also feel that it is also during that time because I have poetry in the background.
Mm-hmm.
Everything I also do, I see it as input for the
Yeah.
poetry.
Yeah. For me, it's story. Every moment of my life. It sometimes annoys people, but like somebody will say something and it'll make me think either of a story or of something I read that it connects to, or a character that I know about, or it's that's like you're saying, it's like background noise. It's always there, and sometimes you bring it forward, and sometimes people, they don't like it when I bring it forward, but it's just that's the way I am. So this is a similar process question, but I think slightly different. Um, when you're working on a poem or starting a poem, do you start with a sense of a theme or how it's going to end, or an idea, or do you
That's a
just
good
sort of
question.
start putting words down and then
Mhm.
it comes together?
Usually, the there are two components. I usually do have a setting. Something about
Mm-hmm.
a setting or an object
Mm-hmm.
triggers an immediate connection or metaphor to life.
Okay.
So, for example, one of the poems I wrote of an ocean wave, I think I've shared that one with you. I
Yeah.
was actually
At the beach.
witnessing
Yeah.
an ocean wave and it triggered an immediate vision and I could identify, but it that vision was a message, a learning experience. How I worked it in, that is something I have to work on. So usually what I have is the image, the metaphor, and the
Mhm.
why,
Mhm.
but not the how.
Right. And then does so if you start to use your example, with a wave coming into the
Mhm.
beach, right?
Mhm.
um by the end, what you have may be very, very different than what you thought you were
Yes.
going to have, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I have a book of poems by someone I really considered a teacher and a mentor, and he passed away a few years ago, and I miss him because our conversations were beautiful. I used to he's there are very few people that I show my poems on an early stage.
Hmm.
They have the essence of the poem. I used to show them to him, and then the next time it would be very different. And there were times when he fought. He's like, I loved that part that you took out, right? And we can get attached to it, but that was not what I wanted to keep.
Right.
So yes, the poem can look very different the essence is the same.
Yeah. And I think yeah, I think when I think about poetry, I love poetry myself. I don't really write it. I've written a few poems in my day, but I'm not a poet by any stretch. But I love poetry and I love reading poetry, and it just seems to me so hard. I mean, I know I used to joke. I had a years ago I had a friend who was a poet, and he wrote sonnets. He wasn't really a friend, he was just a guy I know, and I was a really young guy, and I made some sort of joke to him, and I said, "That's just 14 lines. You write 2 lines a day. In a week, you have a poem, right?" I was kind of saying, "Isn't that
Yeah,
easy, right? Because it's
yeah, yeah,
14
yeah.
lines. How hard can it be, right?"
Right.
But now I understand that it's super hard because every single word has such significance.
Yes.
Um, how do you get to that ending? How do you get to that point where you're satisfied and you say, "Okay, I've done enough editing, polishing, etc."
Usually a deadline.
Yeah. Okay.
It's usually something like, okay, the book needs to be sent in and
Yeah.
submitted.
Yes.
Otherwise, the process is endless. I can spend a
Yes.
week on a word
Hmm.
and toying around with different options of a word because
Hmm.
I know what I want to say. And for some reason, that word isn't yet capturing it.
Yeah.
So I feel but then there is a moment I say, yes, this poem conveys the message.
Hmm.
There are poems I've written and way beyond, way earlier, but a lot of the time it has to do with the act of sharing it with the world.
Right.
It doesn't have to be a full blown publication, but maybe
Yeah.
reading it at an
Yeah.
event or
I had a similar experience where I got to a point. I'd been writing this thing for a pretty long time, and at one point I said, "Okay, I'm done with this part." In other words, I'm ending. I'm saying I'm done, not completely done, but saying I'm done with the phrase in which it's just me writing the book, right?
wow,
And
yeah,
then so then it
yeah,
becomes you share it with other people, and then
yes,
it's a whole other phase, but it's a different phase because you could just keep writing, editing, revising, adding, taking out forever
forever.
without sharing
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Although
And
in
same
poetry,
applies
there's more at stake. It seems to be like there's more risk. I don't know.
because there's fewer words. So
Yeah.
every word has to have, and it's when I watch a movie or watch a series, I really pay attention to every single word because I
Mm-hmm.
know how intentional a writer is in putting the
Mm-hmm.
words in. Saying, but with poetry, there's so few words and so much has to be conveyed in that small vessel
Yep.
that I think there is a lot at stake. One word that throws you off can throw off a whole poem.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
what are your influences? Are there poets, whether famous or not famous, or that have sort of been inspirations for you?
Yes. Yes, for sure. Um, I have obviously the poets that influenced me early on, but I'm going to talk about my more recent inspiration. Um, I definitely I always cite Wisława Szymborska, who is a
Polish poet,
no
right?
yes
Yeah.
Nobel Prize winner. But
Mm-hmm.
and the reason I love her poetry is that she writes so differently because she has such a great sense of irony and a power that is so mm, it's like
Yeah.
understated power in her poems.
So this raises a question though for me, and very much related to you, is does she write in English or in Polish?
She writes in Polish, and
Okay.
so
So
she's
you're
been
reading a
translate.
translation.
I'm reading a translation, and
All
in
right.
fact, I often seek out different translations for her, whether it's
Yeah.
in Spanish or in English. At some
Mm-hmm.
point, I thought I wish I could learn the language just to read her
Yeah.
original poems.
And you write in both Spanish and English, right?
I do, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
I do, and I used to write a lot more in English early on. My
Mm-hmm.
first connection to poetry wasn't reading in English because I went
Mm-hmm.
to an English speaking school and then college. And then I only transitioned to writing in Spanish in my 30s, I
Okay.
would say. Yeah, very
Yeah.
later on in life.
Yeah.
So all my early work is in English.
So
Um,
what other influences do you have?
so I have in Spanish,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm reading Simborska in Spanish.
Okay.
And I have Joan Margarit, who is a Spanish poet. I have Jose Luis Quesada, who's a Honduran poet. And if I could do one thing, it's to have people read Jose Luis Quesada, who
Yeah.
was the mentor I was talking about. He's a fabulous poet.
I'm writing them
And
down.
so those are some of my influences.
Are you
But
when you say
yeah,
they influence you, do they influence you in terms of you want to write, you want to be like them, you want your poetry to be sort of similar to theirs, or do you just really like their poetry, whether it's like yours or not?
I would say I really like their poetry.
Yeah, yeah,
I cannot aspire to be
yeah,
either one of those poets.
yeah, yeah.
No way.
Yeah, I had an experience recently where there's um, we're here at Berea College, and there's a writer here named Silas House who's very well known in the United States. He's from Appalachia, and he's a very accomplished writer. And I read one of his novels, which is about a character, and he writes beautifully about nature and about music and about all that stuff. And I was just sitting outside reading this novel, and I was at the verge of tears for two reasons. One, because it was such beautiful writing, and secondly, because I said I could never write like this. Like it's so good. Like
I know.
I mean, my writing's fine, but it's never going to be like this, right?
And
Yeah,
that's
it's
okay.
okay, right?
It
Yeah,
is okay because
yeah.
it's beautiful to have
Hmm.
that aspirational relation to poetry and also to discover poems that I wish I had written.
Right. Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
only
Yeah.
that I want to be like them, but it's also that they find a way to convey something that I have felt so often and
Hmm.
hadn't found it. And I understand what you're saying about being on the verge of tears. I think that when I first read both of these books, especially John Marguerite, everywhere I could open a book,
Hmm.
his book and or his collected poems, I am at the verge of crying because of the depth of the emotion.
Yeah.
Not that it's sad or happy,
Hmm.
but it is so perfectly expressed and transports me so completely. And just the other day, Leo gave me a gift. Leo, my husband,
Hmm.
gave me a beautiful book called A Century of Poetry in the New Yorker.
Oh
And
yeah.
I opened up the book, and this is how the beauty of poetry, and
Hmm.
to a poet I'd never read before.
Hmm.
And the first four lines were just so beautiful.
Read them for us. Do you have
I
it there?
can, yeah, sure. The poem is called "Things Shouldn't Be So Hard," but it goes, "A
Who's
life."
the poet?
Kay Ryan. Thank you
Okay.
for yeah,
Okay.
Kay Ryan. Things shouldn't be so hard. A life should leave deep tracks, ruts where she went out and back to get the mail or move the hose around the yard.
Hmm.
And the poem is not too long. I can read the whole poem if you
Hmm.
want me to,
Yeah. Go
but
ahead.
it's really those lines that
And
just
I want you to read at least one of yours too. So
so a life should leave. I think I'm going to honor the poem by reading it all, but
yes,
because
please.
I think it's unfair for a poet to just read.
Yes, I agree.
A life should leave deep tracks, ruts where she went out and back to get the mail or move the hose around the yard, where she used to stand before the sink, a worn out place. Beneath her hand, the china knobs rubbed down so to white pastilles. The switch she used to feel for in the dark, almost erased. Her things should keep her marks. The passage of a life should show. It should abrade. And when life stops, a certain space, however small, should be left scarred by the grand and damaging parade.
Hmm.
Things shouldn't be so hard.
Wow. That's beautiful.
It is
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you,
So
Kay Ryan.
what is it about that poem that moved you so, do you think?
I think that I had just left my parents' home where I was staying for a visit, and I had watched my mom go back and forth in her routine, and it showed me it's a very intimate experience, right?
Hmm.
When you hold people very close, you get to witness things in their lives that other
Hmm.
people don't.
Hmm.
And so I wish there were a way for the simple experiences of life to also leave a massive, like a permanent
Leave tracks or leave, I think she
track.
word the word scar even, like leave
Yeah,
something as a reminder.
as a reminder. And I
Yeah.
think that because otherwise they just stay in our memory.
Hmm.
And my mom often mentions how she may be the last person to remember several people in her family.
Yeah.
and what a responsibility it is,
Oh
and
my
why she
gosh. Yeah.
often wants to talk about them,
Sure.
and how I often feel that poetry is also a way of capturing and making permanent the fleeting.
Right.
And so just that sense of
Making permanent the
permanence.
fleeting. I think you need to put that in a poem.
I think so.
That phrase. So I'm gonna ask maybe one or two more questions, but I'd love you to read at least one or two of your own poems. So one of the things you wrote to me as I was asking you to like help me, think about how to talk about this with you is um, you said you're enchanted by poetry as a means for shedding a light on the hidden or giving new light to things. Talk about that. How do you, uh, in what way does your poetry or maybe any poem um, sort of shed a light on the hidden?
And I think it also has to do with the stories. We can be very intentional about what we see or we don't see, and sometimes a voice can be hidden
Mhm.
and be given light by simply being shared in a poem. So, for example, if I talk about someone whose voice is not heard, that's
Mhm.
one way, for example, that a poem can shed a light. It also allows us to see things in multiple perspectives. So, a memory I may have can be can be seen in one way or another. And I think that if I shine the in the sadness, for example, if I can shine a light of beauty to a
Mhm.
moment, to because of whether it's the learning or simply the having lived,
Mhm.
then poetry gives us a way of healing by shining a beautiful light to something that we often see as negative.
Yeah.
A bad memory
Yeah.
can suddenly become a learning opportunity. A
Mhm.
goodbye can mean I did experience the beauty of having been with that
Yeah.
person.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean in one
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. That's really cool. Would you mind reading at least one poem
Yes, but I just
in
realized that
English
in
because
English, right? So let me try to find a poem in English. There is a poem that I read at a recent event, a recent um, poetry. It's actually a regional leadership gathering,
Mhm.
but I was able to invited to read a poem, and I have the version of it in both Spanish and English. And in English, it's called Convergence.
Mhm.
So I can read this poem for you.
Okay.
Convergence. I watch the crossing at 34th and 6th. To the rhythm of a traffic light, a row of black coats treads onward like crows condemned to the pavement. Once I crossed this corner just like them, my body leaning forward, chin against my chest, winter sealed in my bones. I still feel the pulse of that pace in my pupils, and in my throat, the words I never shared with a stranger. I tried to return as a tourist to the city I once lived in, but a part of its streets belongs to me. The sediment of everything I've lived overlays the landscape, alters the texture, traps into the crevices what was lost along the way. Today, all my silences converge at this crossroad. The act of returning is another way of measuring how much the soul has passed through.
Wow. That's beautiful. I mean, at
Thank
first,
you.
my first thought, the image of um, people crossing the street in New York in the winter. It's cold. Most people in New York in the winter are wearing black, right? Um, and maybe you were too, but knowing you, it conjured this image in my mind of sort of the Central American girl from the sun, walking, trying to fit into this like dark, fast, cold city, um, uh, which You probably did. I mean, you probably wanted to, found out. You probably fell in love with New York at some point.
Yes.
Yeah, we
Mm.
kind of all do. I think at some point.
Right?
Yeah, I didn't like it first when I went there either. Um, but then in the end, can you read the sort of last line again?
The act of returning is another way of measuring how much the soul has passed through, how much the soul has traveled.
Yeah, the act of returning to someplace. When you wrote that, what were you thinking about? Like, what was the? Or maybe you weren't thinking about anything. It was just a line. But what were you thinking about there?
So for me, it's that I lived in New York City for several
Hmm.
years,
Hmm.
and but when I returned, I, s- I realized just how much my soul had evolved and changed,
Yeah.
that I could no longer relate to that same person who used to cross the streets that way.
Hmm.
And so returning is also a way of knowing how much you've grown or
Yeah.
not, or how
Yeah.
far you've diverted from a certain path.
It's a marker of time and of your own experience, and you sort of stop and think, boy, I haven't been here in a while, and I feel very different in this space than I did last time I was here. Um,
Yes.
yeah, that's really cool.
Thank you.
And again, like the ability to capture that in a line, is just sort of, I just admire that so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Is there another one? I mean, I want to make you search through all of
No,
your stuff, but
sure.
is there anything
No, I
else?
can read a
Because I
poem
know
that
we
a
don't have a
shorter
ton of time,
poem.
but yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I'll read a poem that I've read in also again in an Aspen event, and it's called Shadow.
Oh, I know
And
that
this
poem.
is I'd say it's my favorite poem
Hmm.
because of what it means
Hmm.
at so many levels.
Hmm.
So shadow. Ponder for a moment what a shadow is. A space without light, presence in absence, the shape of anything but itself. I see you playing on the grass beneath the trees, and I believe it's not too soon for me to tell you this. Never be shadowed, child. Color the wind with your laughter, moisten the ground with your tears. Be the oar that stirs the water, not the ripple. Be the voice that breaks the silence, not the echo. Be song, be scar, be question, be anything but shadow. Be life in all its complicated splendor.
I love that poem. I know that poem. I've heard you. I, the first time I ever met you, even before I met you, I Googled you because we were interviewing you for a job. And the first thing I found was you reading that poem at an event. And I just said, that's who we want to hire. Not that your job had anything to do with
I
poetry,
know.
but it was just like, oh my gosh. So I think that's such an incredible story and a message. And were you, I mean, that poem has such a strong inspirational, aspirational message. Were you thinking about that when you started? Did you set out to write a poem like that?
Yes. It all came at once, and I get
Hmm.
very emotional with that poem.
Yeah, yeah.
But the whole poem came at once, and I was literally in a park standing under the shade of a tree,
Hmm.
and I was watching my 2-year-old daughter,
Hmm.
and I was talking to her, and I was talking to anyone who might have a shadow cast upon them. And I was also talking to myself. And this is how we can be intentional about the stories we tell, right? I can
Hmm.
choose, there's a path we can choose, and poetry allows me to reflect and choose the the way I want to experience that moment, and her future, my future, and anyone's future. Um, so the feeling immediately came to me, and then the poem came out. It's been edited for sure, right? But
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
I set out to write that with that feeling
And
of no,
right.
no.
And for me, that poem is so connected to the work you still do in Honduras and that I helped you do for a few years in encouraging young people who are living in shadow. to come out of the shadow and be any, like you say, anything but shadow, and have a voice, have agency, have power, be anything but darkness or shadow, or be in the light. And it was amazing how that all came together. And you wrote that long before you were doing this
Yes,
work.
yes.
But it encapsulates, I think, the work you're doing currently, with kids in Honduras. How do you feel about that?
I absolutely agree. And I think that we carve a path. Um, I knew from early on in my life that somehow I wanted to be connected to shedding that kind of a light, not creating the light, but revealing the light
Mhm.
in in people and in circumstances. So what I love about poetry is that it just captures it and recognizes it. And I feel that from as I mentioned, I suffered very much in witnessing any kind of bullying or any kind of hurting others. And so I've been seeking for a long time a type of work that gives me hope, the same kind of hope of the poetry. And I think this work with youth, because I can see in them their potential, and it's beautiful to see them see it in themselves as well, and then
Yeah,
blossom
yeah,
and
yeah.
create opportunities for others. Because I just heard a story of two kids who of a fifth of a 11-year-old who started attending school at El Hogar a year ago, didn't know how to read and write,
Hmm.
learned in this year through advanced tutoring.
Hmm.
And now she and a friend of hers have created a tutoring program for kids in her community.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So, it's just,
Yeah,
it's beautiful to see it come full
yeah,
circle.
yeah,
And
absolutely. So I know you have a new book coming out, right? Soon.
well, I'm working on
You're
it. I'm
working on
still
it.
working on it.
Okay,
It's
okay,
not coming out
okay.
yet.
And does that book have a particular theme
It's,
or?
oh boy, it's actually about, it doesn't have the name. So the name is usually the last thing that comes to me. And
Mm,
it's interesting. Um, it has happened in both of my previous books, but the theme is the invisible, and it's about bringing out, um, shining a light on what's invisible, and often in the case of voices that we're not hearing, people that we're not seeing,
mhm,
moments and situations that we're not embracing. So it's all about what's invisible, and how we are contributing with our silence
mm,
to keep it there.
mhm. To keep things that we need to look at. Is that what you mean?
Yes,
Yeah,
by simply not reacting, not saying, not
right.
speaking, not interacting.
Mhm,
One of the poems is about a man that I kept running into and who worked. I don't know if he still worked there, because I haven't gone in a while. But a man who I used to see every single day, and he was the guard, safety guard, for a parking lot. And I
mhm,
would see him every day, and every day I'd say hello, and he'd say hello, and every day. But I had never smiled at him.
mm.
And this one, because it's like at the beginning of the day or the end of the day
Sure.
when we're so full of things. So I would greet him,
Mhm,
but I hadn't smiled.
mhm,
And then when I smiled, he smiled back with the biggest smile I've ever seen in my life. And it completely changed our relationship,
mhm,
because I was no longer just being respectful, but connecting. And I think that his smile was going to be invisible to me until
mhm.
I was willing to show myself as well. And so this is what the book is about, these little moments of connection that are invisible.
And this book is in Spanish.
It's in Spanish.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we'll look forward to it, and we'll look forward to the
Thank you so much,
translation.
Tim.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So Denise Vargas is a poet, and an MBA, one of the greatest combinations in the world. But as you've heard today, poetry is really at the center of her life and in her soul, and a motivator for a lot of the work she does. And so you can find her. Just look her up. You can find her books. How many are there now? Out two?
I have two books, and I am also in several anthologies,
Okay.
but two full books,
Yeah.
published books.
So thank you so much for this, Denise. I really appreciate you talking to me about what you really want to talk about. And I'm so glad this is what you chose, because it means a lot to me. And I think our listeners will be, again, like I keep saying this, but this is chapter 6 of this podcast. And each time it reveals something to me about a subject either me I know something about or not that much about. But I learn and I grow and I feel. And I think this time was probably the time I felt the most during my conversation with you. So
Mm,
thanks so much for
thank
sharing that
you.
with us.
Thank you so much, Tim. Thanks for giving uh, people like us the opportunity to talk about what we're passionate about,
Mhm.
not, what we usually talk about. I
Yeah,
loved it. I love that opportunity. And to me, it was particularly special because I got the chance to reconnect with you. And
yeah,
because I also know how much you love poetry and
right.
that you're a writer yourself.
Hmm.
So it had so many layers of joy to
Yeah.
have to be in this podcast with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Denise. And we'll find another time when you can come back and talk about something else that you really want to
Excellent.
talk about. Yeah.
Fantastic.
All right. Thank you.